He was a first sergeant, a monument of doctrine and discipline, and she was a ghost in sterile civilian clothes. In the oppressive heat before 500 soldiers standing in rigid formation, he put his hand on her, a public display of force intended to shatter her quiet defiance. Seconds later, his world went dark, not from a retaliatory fist, but from a whisper of applied physics he could never hope to comprehend. His authority, so absolute moments before, collapsed along with his body. This is the story of how a woman broke a man of war, not with a weapon, but with a rock, and the terrible knowledge of the world beneath his feet. The air at Forward Operating Base Erebus was not air. It was a slurry of fine-grained silica, diesel exhaust, and baked earth. It coated the tongue, gritted between the teeth, and settled in the lungs as a permanent sediment. The base was a raw wound carved into the floor of a valley in the Hindu Kush, a place where mountains did not simply rise. They clawed at the sky, their peaks like shards of obsidian. They were old mountains, geologically angry, and they held the silence of millennia in their granite hearts. That silence was a physical presence, a pressure against the eardrums that made the constant, grinding thrum of the base generators feel like an intrusion, a sacrilege. The sun was a malevolent star, bleaching the color from everything it touched, turning the dun-colored HESCO barriers and the faded camouflage of uniforms into a monotonous, weary palette. To exist at FOB Erebus was to be in a constant state of low-grade abrasion, scoured by the wind, the sun, and the suffocating proximity of the rock that hemmed them in on all sides. Dr. Aris Thorne moved through this environment as if she were made of different matter. Where the soldiers hunched against the elements, she seemed to absorb them. Where they saw a wall of hostile rock, she saw a manuscript written in strata and stress fractures. She was a civilian contractor, her official designation a masterpiece of bureaucratic ambiguity, geotechnical analyst. To the soldiers, this meant she was the rock lady, an oddity, a scientist sent by some distant, nonsensical command to study dirt in a war zone. She carried no weapon, wore no rank, and her uniform consisted of durable khaki trousers, a moisture-wicking slate-gray shirt, and sturdy boots. Her dark hair was always pulled back in a severe, functional knot, and her face, sharp-featured and devoid of makeup, was perpetually angled downward, her attention fixed on the datapad she carried, or a fragment of stone she had plucked from the ground. Her work was a quiet, methodical ritual that the inhabitants of Erebus found both baffling and vaguely irritating. She would walk the perimeter, not with the tense, scanning gaze of a guard, but with a slow, deliberate pace, her eyes tracing lines in the cliffs that no one else could see. She would stop, press a small silver disc, a portable seismic resonator, against a rock face and watch the dancing lines on her datapad. She collected samples, chunks of schist, fragments of gneiss, pebbles of quartzite. Back in her small, climate-controlled container, a space she had bartered for with the logistics officer, she would analyze them with an intensity that bordered on obsession. She would tap them with a small tungsten hammer, listening not just with her ears, but with sensors that translated the impact into complex waveform data. She was listening to the voice of the mountain, and it was telling her secrets. The soldiers, when they noticed her at all, saw a woman playing with stones. They could not see the intricate, three-dimensional model of lithospheric stress and resonant frequencies building in her mind, a map of the valley's very bones and their breaking points. First, Sergeant Marcus Rourke saw a problem. He was a man carved from the same granite as the mountains, but without any of their patience. His worldview was a fortress built of regulations, discipline, and the unshakable conviction that volume was a direct substitute for nuance. He had served 22 years, and in that time he had come to believe that the Army's way was the only way, and his interpretation of that way was infallible. His voice was a blunt instrument, a gravelly bark that could strip paint and morale with equal efficiency. He moved with the solid, planted certainty of a man who had never once questioned his own authority. He saw FOB Erebus not as a geological anomaly, but as a tactical problem to be managed through overwhelming adherence to standard operating procedure. And Dr. Eris Thorne was not in his standard operating procedure. She was an anomaly, a civilian who moved outside the rigid geometry of military life. She did not attend formations. She did not respond to the bugle calls that marked the day. She took her meals at odd hours, often alone, her attention buried in her datapad. Rourke saw this not as the focus of a specialist, but as a flagrant display of disrespect. She was a loose thread in the tightly woven tapestry of his command, and his instinct was to pull it hard. His resentment simmered, a low-grade thermal event beneath the surface of his professional demeanor. He was waiting for an opportunity, a public moment where he could reassert the unassailable hierarchy of rank and uniform over this quiet, maddeningly self-contained woman. The mountain was patient, but the first sergeant was not. The opportunity arrived on a blisteringly hot Tuesday. The entire battalion, over 500 soldiers, was assembled on the main parade ground, a flat expanse of compacted gravel that shimmered with heat haze. They stood in perfectly aligned company formations, their bodies rigid, sweat tracing clean paths through the dust on their necks. First Sergeant Rourke stood before them on a small, raised platform, his hands clasped behind his back, his jaw set like a vice. The battalion commander, Lieutenant Colonel Davies, stood beside him, but it was Rourke who owned the space. This was his theater. He was delivering a tirade about lax grooming standards, his voice rolling over the silent ranks, each word a hammer blow of disappointment. "This is not a vacation," Rourke boomed, his voice amplified by the unnatural stillness of the valley. "This is a combat zone. And in a combat zone, discipline is the only thing that separates us from the animals. It is the line between life and death. When your razor is dull, your rifle is dirty. When your boots are unbloused, your mind is weak. There are no exceptions." It was at that precise moment that Eris Thorne appeared. She was walking along the edge of the parade ground, her path taking her from the western perimeter fence toward her containerized lab. She was oblivious to the formation, or, more accurately, she had categorized it as an irrelevant data point in her current mission. Her focus was absolute. In her hand, she held a piece of granite, its surface glinting with mica. Her thumb traced the grain of the rock, feeling its texture, its history. Her datapad was tucked under her other arm. She moved with her usual silent purpose, a ghost passing through a tableau of rigid flesh and steel. Rourke stopped mid-sentence. A vein throbbed in his temple. It was perfect, a public transgression, a flawless opportunity to make his point in front of everyone. He could feel 500 pairs of eyes on him, waiting to see what he would do. The silence stretched, becoming heavy and charged. "You," he barked. The single word cracked like a whip. Eris did not stop. She did not look up. Her name was not you. The sound was merely another part of the ambient noise, less significant than the low hum from the generator farm or the faint, high-pitched whine of the wind through the razor wire. Rourke's face darkened. The public nature of her disregard was an intolerable insult. "Civilian! I am talking to you!" he roared. This time, the volume and specificity of the address were enough to penetrate her concentration. She stopped and slowly raised her head, her eyes blinking once, adjusting to the figure on the platform. Her expression was not one of defiance or fear, but of mild, analytical curiosity, as if she were examining an unexpected geological formation. "Halt!" Rourke commanded, stepping down from the platform and striding toward her. His boots crunched on the gravel with angry precision. The entire battalion watched, motionless. This was better than a speech. This was a demonstration. He marched directly to her, invading her personal space, his large frame looming over her slighter one. He was close enough for her to smell the starch on his uniform and the faint, acrid scent of his self-righteous anger. "Do you see this?" Rourke said, his voice a low, dangerous growl. He gestured with a sweep of his arm to the silent, watching army. "This is a battalion formation. When a battalion formation is in progress, you stop. You render respect. You do not wander through it like you're at a goddamn farmer's market. Is that understood?" Eris considered his statement. She processed the words, the tone, the context. Her internal analysis concluded that his emotional state was irrelevant to her primary objective. "My work is time-sensitive," she stated simply. Her voice was quiet, flat, carrying no inflection of apology or argument. It was a statement of fact, as plain and unadorned as the rock in her hand. This clinical response was gasoline on the fire of Rourke's fury. He saw it as the height of arrogance. He, First Sergeant Marcus Rourke, was being dismissed in front of his men. "Your work?" He spat the word, incredulous. "Your work is playing with rocks. My work is keeping these soldiers alive, and that work depends on discipline, which you are actively undermining." He took another step forward, his chest puffed out. He was going to make an example of her that no one would ever forget. "You are a guest here, a civilian contractor. That means you fall under my authority for matters of base discipline and good order. You will come with me to the commander's office, and we will have a long discussion about your role here." He reached out, his hand a thick, calloused slab of meat, and grabbed her left arm just above the elbow. His grip was steel, intended to be painful, to drag her, to demonstrate his physical and hierarchical dominance. It was his final mistake. For Aris, the world did not slow down. It simply resolved into a series of clear, predictable data points. Threat assessment, localized, physical, non-lethal. Antagonist's mass, approximately 105 kilograms. Velocity, low. Point of contact, left brachial region. His grip was a vector of force. His body was a system of levers and fulcrums. Her response was not a thought, but an equation solved in milliseconds. She did not try to pull away. That would have been a contest of strength, a contest she would lose. Instead, she flowed with the force he applied. As he pulled, she pivoted on the ball of her right foot, a subtle, almost imperceptible shift of her center of gravity. Her left hand, the one holding the data pad, came up, not to strike, but to brace. Her right hand, the one holding the granite sample, moved with an unnatural calm. She released the rock, letting it drop to the gravel. Her fingers, now free, curled slightly. She didn't make a fist. She didn't aim for his face or his torso. Her target was a tiny, obscure point on the inside of his forearm. a place where the median nerve, the ulnar nerve, and the brachial artery run close to the surface, just beneath the pronator teres muscle. It was a spot known in certain circles as a neurovascular compression point, a place of exquisite vulnerability. Her thumb and forefinger, hardened by years of handling rock and precise instrumentation, came together like a pair of calipers. She didn't punch. She didn't slap. She pressed. It was a sharp, focused, precisely calibrated application of pressure, driven by the subtle rotation of her hips. The force required was minimal, less than opening a stubborn jar. The effect was catastrophic, an explosive incandescent bolt of pure neurological fire shot up Rourke's arm. It was not pain in the conventional sense. It was a system crash. Every signal from his brain to his arm was instantaneously overwritten by a tidal wave of white-hot static. His grip on her arm vanished as his hand became a useless claw. The signal scrambled his entire peripheral nervous system on his right side. His vision tunneled. A wave of vertigo seized him as his brain struggled to process the incomprehensible sensory overload. His right leg, receiving garbled commands, simply gave out. First Sergeant Marcus Rourke collapsed. He didn't fall gracefully. He crumpled, his body folding in on itself like a building undergoing a controlled demolition. He landed in a heap on the gravel, conscious but completely disoriented, his right arm flopping uselessly beside him, a tingling, electric numbness spreading through his entire torso. He gasped, trying to draw a breath, his mind reeling. He had been untouched, yet he was utterly broken. A collective gasp went through the 500 soldiers. It was a soft, sibilant sound, the only noise in the vast, ringing silence that followed. They had seen him grab her. They had seen her move, a flicker of motion too small to properly register. And then the first sergeant, their titan, their immovable object, was on the ground. Eris stood over him, her expression unchanged. She looked down not with triumph or anger, but with the detached curiosity of a scientist observing a predictable chemical reaction. She bent down, her movements fluid and economical, and retrieved her piece of granite from the gravel. She tucked her datapad back under her arm. She looked at the heap that had been First Sergeant Rourke and repeated her earlier statement, her voice cutting through the stunned silence with surgical precision. My work is time-sensitive. Then she turned and walked away, her boots making soft, rhythmic sounds on the gravel, leaving behind a fallen giant and an army of silent witnesses. The legend of the Rock Lady had just begun. The immediate aftermath was a study in institutional paralysis. Lieutenant Colonel Davies, a man more comfortable with paperwork than with crisis, seemed frozen on the platform. Two medics, their training screaming at them to act, rushed forward and knelt beside Rourke, their faces a mixture of confusion and fear. Rourke was conscious, sputtering, trying to push himself up with his one good arm, his face a mask of incandescent rage and profound humiliation. The incident was over in less than a minute, but the shockwave it sent through the command structure of FOB Erebus was a seismic event of the highest magnitude. The hierarchy had been publicly, inexplicably, and efficiently inverted. In her container, the air thick with the cool, sterile hum of her equipment, Eris had already dismissed the confrontation. It was a variable that had been neutralized. Her focus was back on the data. The rock she had retrieved was a piece of garnet-bearing schist. She placed it under a digital microscope, its magnified image appearing on a large monitor. She was not looking at its beauty, but at the microfractures lacing its structure, tiny fissures that told a story of immense and recent stress. Her fingers flew across the keyboard of a connected console, integrating the new visual data with the seismic readings she had been collecting all week. A pattern was emerging, a terrifying symmetry she had suspected but now saw with undeniable clarity. The mountains were not just sitting there, they were alive with tension. The entire valley was a single interconnected system of geological stress, wound tight as a spring. The enemy, the faceless, persistent insurgency they had been fighting for months, seemed to have understood this in a primal, intuitive way. Their recent activity had been strange. Fewer direct attacks, more small, seemingly random demolitions high in the surrounding cliffs. The command staff had dismissed them as failed attempts to trigger rock slides on the base. Aris knew better. They weren't failed attempts. They were tuning forks. They were plucking the strings of the mountain, searching for the right note. The crisis arrived 3 hours later, just as the sun began its slow descent, painting the peaks in hues of blood and rust. It started not with an explosion, but with a sound, a deep, guttural groan that seemed to emanate from the bedrock itself. It was a sound that vibrated in the bones, a low-frequency wave of pure dread. The ground beneath FOB Erebus trembled, a gentle but deeply unsettling tremor that rattled equipment and sloshed water in canteens. Then the reports flooded the Tactical Operations Center. Watchtower 4, we have a rock slide on the north face. MSR Cougar is completely blocked. Patrol Bravo 6, we are cut off. Repeat, cut off. The canyon pass just collapsed behind us. Sir, the perimeter sensors on the east side are going crazy. The ground is shifting. The TOC, a cavernous, sandbag-reinforced bunker, descended into controlled chaos. Maps glowed on screens, operators shouted into headsets, and runners darted between stations. Lieutenant Colonel Davies stood at the center of it all, his face pale, his expression overwhelmed. First Sergeant Rourke was there, his right arm in a sling, his face a thundercloud of repressed fury. His humiliation had been superseded by the urgent need to act, to impose order on the chaos, to prove that his methods, the Army's methods, were the only ones that mattered. Get me a drone over that pass. I want eyes on Bravo 6 now, Rourke barked, his voice raw. Tell the engineers to saddle up. We're blowing a path through that MSR blockage. I want 2 Bradleys for security. Move! His orders were classic Rourke, direct, forceful, and utterly wrong. They were an attempt to apply brute force to a problem that was surgical in its nature. He saw a pile of rocks blocking a road. The solution was to make smaller rocks with high explosives. He saw a patrol cut off. The solution was to send more men and metal to rescue them. He was treating the symptoms, not the disease. First Sergeant, that's not advisable, a voice said, cutting through the noise. It was the young engineering officer, a lieutenant named Chen. Sir, the ground is unstable. Introducing more high explosives or even the vibrations from heavy armor, it could trigger a secondary, larger slide. Rourke turned on him, his eyes blazing. Are you telling me how to do my job, Lieutenant? We have men trapped. We move. That's what we do. Get your people ready, or I will find an officer who can. Chen paled and fell silent, defeated by the sheer force of Rourke's rank and certainty. The machine of conventional response ground into motion. An engineering team was dispatched toward the blocked MSR. A quick reaction force, a heavy platoon mounted in MRAPs, began to mobilize to push toward Bravo 6's last known location. Rourke was in his element, shouting orders, driving his soldiers, fighting the war he understood. He was fighting the enemy. He failed to realize the enemy was now using the mountain as its primary weapon, and he was helping them. Eris watched it all unfold on a secondary monitor in her lab, which was patched into the TOC's drone feeds. She saw the engineering convoy approach the massive rock slide on MSR Cougar. She saw the QRF begin its slow, lumbering journey up the narrow canyon. Her seismic sensors were screaming, the data painting a terrifying picture. The enemy's initial blast had not just blocked the road, it had critically destabilized the entire mountain face above it. It was a trap. The vibrations from the approaching American vehicles were adding to the load, pushing the delicately balanced system toward a catastrophic failure point. She ran a final simulation. The variables were all there: the mass of the rock face, the sheer strength of the strata, the current seismic resonance, and the added harmonic vibrations from the approaching convoy. The result was unequivocal. It was a kill box, engineered with geological precision. She had to act. She grabbed her datapad and strode out of her container, moving with a speed and purpose that no one on the FOB had ever seen from her. She didn't walk to the TOC, she ran. She burst through the bunker doors, the sudden sunlight behind her silhouetting her for a moment. The guards, accustomed to her quiet presence, were too stunned to stop her. She moved past the frantic operators and technicians and walked directly to the central command console where Davies and Rourke stood. "You have to call them back," she said, her voice devoid of panic, yet carrying an urgency that made several operators turn to look. "Now!" Rourke turned, his face a mask of disbelief. "Get out of my TOC," he snarled. "You have no authority here." "In approximately 90 seconds, Eris continued, ignoring him completely and addressing Davies. "The vibrations from the engineering convoy will cause a resonant cascade failure in the schist formation directly above their position. The resulting landslide will be an order of magnitude larger than the first. It will not just block the road, it will bury it, and your men under 100,000 tons of rock." She didn't raise her voice. She stated it as a fact, a weather report of impending doom. "That's insane," Rourke scoffed. "You're a geologist, not a fortune teller." "I am a physicist specializing in resonant seismology," Eris corrected him, her tone clinical. She tapped her datapad, and with a few keystrokes, she hijacked the main holographic display in the center of the room. Rourke's tactical map of friendly and enemy positions vanished, replaced by a terrifying three-dimensional wireframe model of the valley. It was a web of glowing red and yellow lines, pulsing with latent energy. It was the mountain's skeleton, and it was screaming. "This is the current lithospheric stress model. The enemy did not miss. They placed a small charge at a pre-calculated fulcrum point. They used our own response against us. Your convoy is the final key in their lock." Davies stared at the holographic display, his mouth agape. It was like nothing he had ever seen, a god's eye view of the world's hidden machinery. He was a history major from a military college. This was a language he couldn't even begin to parse. But the conviction in her voice, the cold, hard certainty of her data, was more compelling than Rourke's bluster. 70 seconds, Eris stated flatly. The chaos in the TOC had died down. Everyone was watching, listening. They were watching the woman who had taken down the first sergeant with a touch, and now she was predicting the end of the world in real time. A young communications specialist, Corporal Eva Rostova, stared at the screen, her eyes wide. She had a background in signal processing, and while the geology was alien to her, the language of frequencies and resonance was not. "Sir," she whispered to Davies, it's a forced harmonic oscillation, like the Tacoma Narrows Bridge. She's right. The math is sound." Rourke looked at Rostova with betrayal in his eyes, then back at Aris. "This is a trick, some academic nonsense. We have men out there." "You have men driving into a grave you are helping to dig," Aris countered, her voice still level. "Your QRF is also in danger. The canyon they are in has a natural resonant frequency of 12.4 hertz. The combined engine vibrations of their MRAPs are currently producing a harmonic at 12.1 hertz. They are tuning the canyon for collapse. 50 seconds, she added. The moment stretched, thick with consequence. Davies was trapped between the unshakable certainty of his first sergeant's traditionalism and the terrifying alien logic of this woman. He looked at Rourke's face, contorted with rage, and then at Aris's, which was as calm and unreadable as the surface of a deep lake. He looked at the glowing, pulsing map of the mountain's stress. He made a choice. "All call signs, this is Erebus 6, Davies spoke into his headset, his voice tight. "Cease mission. I repeat, cease mission. All vehicles, halt your advance and kill your engines. Immediately. Bravo 6, do not move. Acknowledge." A chorus of confused acknowledgments came back over the speakers. Out on the MSR, the engineering convoy ground to a halt. In the narrow canyon, the QRF's engines sputtered into silence. Rourke stared at Davies in pure disbelief. "Sir, what are you doing? You're letting a civilian spook you into paralysis." "Silence, First Sergeant," Davies snapped, a surprising firmness in his voice. He was looking at Aris. "What now?" Aris's eyes were fixed on the data streaming from her remote sensors. 10 seconds. The TOC was utterly silent. Every person held their breath, their eyes glued to the main screen, which now showed the live feed from a drone circling high above the MSR. They saw the convoy of engineering vehicles, silent and still on the road, a few hundred meters from the initial rockslide. The countdown on Aris's datapad reached 0. For a moment, nothing happened. Rourke let out a short, triumphant laugh. "See? Nothing. A hysterical overreaction based on—" He was cut off by a deep, cracking roar that came through the drone's microphone, a sound so immense it felt like the world was tearing itself apart. The entire top third of the mountain face above the road seemed to dissolve. It didn't slide. It liquefied, a titanic wave of rock, earth, and shattered trees that cascaded down the slope with unbelievable speed. It crossed the road not where the engineers were, but exactly where they would have been if they had continued their advance for another 90 seconds. The wall of debris, hundreds of feet high, obliterated the road and slammed into the opposite side of the valley, sending a plume of dust thousands of feet into the air. The silence that followed was more profound than the noise that preceded it. The soldiers in the TOC stared at the screen, at the place where a mountain and a road used to be. They looked at the still, safe convoy. They looked at the calm, unassuming woman who had just saved them from a catastrophe of unimaginable proportions. Authority did not need to be seized. In that moment of collective, horrified awe, it flowed to Aris Thorne like water seeking its own level. She was no longer the rock lady. She was the only person in the room who understood the real enemy. "The enemy has a seismologist," Aris stated, her voice cutting through the stunned silence of the TOC. It was not a question. It was a diagnosis. Or someone with access to geological survey data and the software to model it. They are not guessing. They are calculating. Lieutenant Colonel Davies, his face ashen, turned his full attention to her. The last vestiges of his reliance on Rourke's conventional wisdom had been pulverized along with the mountain. "What do you propose, Doctor?" The use of her formal title was a clear and public transfer of authority. Rourke, standing by the console with his arm in a sling, looked as if he had been struck again. "We cannot fight the mountain," Eris said, her fingers dancing across her datapad. She brought up a new display on the holographic map. This one showed the valley not as a solid mass, but as a complex network of interconnected nodal points and resonant frequencies. "So we must pacify it. The enemy is using targeted, high-energy input to trigger failures at critical stress points. We must counter this with low-energy, wide-spectrum harmonic input. We will not break the mountain, we will calm it." The concept was so alien to the military mindset in the room that it was met with blank stares. All except for one. Corporal Rostova, the communications specialist, stepped forward. "Ma'am," she began, her voice hesitant but clear. "You're talking about destructive interference, using a counter frequency to cancel out the active one." Aris looked at Rostova, a flicker of acknowledgement in her eyes. It was the first time she had truly seen someone else in the room as a peer in any capacity. "Precisely, Corporal. The entire valley floor has a primary resonant frequency of approximately 3.4 Hz, with multiple harmonic vulnerabilities. The enemy is exploiting one of them. We will introduce a broad-spectrum, sub-audible frequency blanket, a white noise of seismic energy, to dampen the entire system. It will make the mountain deaf to their tuning forks." "How do we do that?" Davies asked, now fully committed. "We don't have that kind of equipment." "Yes, you do," Eris countered. "You simply think of it as something else." Her plan unfolded, a symphony of repurposed technology that was as elegant as it was bizarre. "Corporal Rostova, I need you to retask the 3 main PSYOP broadcast towers. Bypass the audio amplifiers. I need you to push a raw, oscillating 3.0 to 4.0 Hz carrier wave directly through the primary emitters. Maximum power." Rostova's eyes widened. "Ma'am, that's not what they're for. We could burn out the emitters." "They will handle it for the required duration," Eris stated with absolute certainty. "Their design specifications allow for frequency ranges far below the audible spectrum for classified applications. This qualifies." Rostova, hearing the ring of undeniable truth, nodded and immediately turned to her console, her fingers flying. The bridge of trust had been formed. "Next," Eris continued, turning to the artillery officer, "I need your M777 howitzers. I don't want high explosives. I want your heaviest non-explosive drill rounds. If you don't have those, use concrete piercing shells with the fuses removed. I have a sequence of 8 targets here." She projected a new set of coordinates onto the map. They were not enemy positions. They were seemingly random points on the valley's surrounding ridges. "They must be fired in this exact sequence, with a 19-second interval between each impact. No more, no less." The artillery officer, a captain who worshipped at the altar of fire missions, looked bewildered. "Ma'am, you want us to fire duds? At rocks?" "I want you to deliver precise kinetic energy to 8 specific geological nodes," Eris corrected him. "The impacts will create a series of overlapping seismic ripples. The 19-second interval will ensure those ripples combine into a complex, non-repeating interference pattern. Think of it as a rhythmic disruption. It will break up the harmonic coherence the enemy is trying to build." Finally, she turned to the aviation liaison. "I need 2 UH-60 Black Hawks. I need them to fly a precise figure-8 pattern over the canyon where Bravo 6 is trapped, at an altitude of exactly 100 feet above the canyon rim. Their rotor wash, when synchronized, will create a persistent downdraft, a column of air pressure that will physically dampen the low-frequency vibrations propagating through that specific gorge. The room was silent again, but this time it was the silence of intense concentration. The soldiers and officers were scrambling to recontextualize the tools of war they had known their entire careers. Howitzers were not for killing, they were for tuning. PSYOP speakers were not for propaganda, they were for broadcasting silence. Helicopters were not for transport, they were for creating wind. It was a paradigm shift of staggering proportions. Rourke finally found his voice, a strangled rasp. This is a circus. You are playing with my soldiers' lives based on a fantasy. Davies, you cannot let this happen. Davies didn't even look at him. His eyes were locked on Aris. Do it, he commanded, his voice resonating with newfound authority. All stations, you have your orders. Execute on Dr. Thorne's command. The symphony began. Corporal Rostova, her brow furrowed in concentration, rerouted the power from the PSYOP emitters, pushing a wave of energy into the earth that was felt not as sound, but as a faint, almost subliminal vibration in the soles of their boots. A deep, silent hum that was the antithesis of the mountain's groan of protest. High on the ridge, the artillery crews worked with a confused but professional urgency. The first howitzer roared, but it was a clipped, violent bark, not followed by the satisfying crump of a detonation. Miles away, a heavy shell slammed into a rock face with a dull, percussive thud. An impact felt more than it was heard. 19 seconds later, the second gun fired. Then the third. A slow, ponderous drumbeat, striking the bones of the earth. Over the trapped patrol, 2 Black Hawks descended, their rotors beating the air into submission. They began their slow, graceful, and utterly bizarre aerial ballet, weaving a figure-8 of wind and pressure over the vulnerable canyon. The men of Bravo 6, huddled by their silent vehicles, looked up in utter bewilderment at the strange ritual being performed for their benefit. In the TOC, Aris stood like a conductor before her orchestra, her eyes scanning dozens of data streams on her personal device. She was monitoring the valley's seismic response, watching as her inputs began to alter the equation. The angry, spiking red lines of harmonic resonance began to flatten, smoothed out by the blanket of white noise from the towers. The coherent patterns were being disrupted by the rhythmic, chaotic impacts of the artillery. The specific vulnerability threatening Bravo 6 was being smothered under a blanket of air pressure. "Report," Aris said to the drone operator. "Is the enemy attempting another detonation?" "Ma'am, we have a thermal bloom at a new location, Grid Square." The operator rattled off the coordinates. It was another demolition charge, placed at another carefully chosen stress point. "Detonation imminent." "Let them," Aris said, her voice calm. On the drone feed, they saw a puff of smoke and dust from a cliff face miles away. The enemy had played their next card. But this time, the effect was completely different. There was no groan from the earth. There was no tremor. The explosion, which moments ago would have triggered another devastating slide, was a dud. It was a firecracker, its energy absorbed and dissipated by the newly pacified mass of the mountain. It was like shouting into a hurricane. The mountain was no longer listening. A wave of relieved, breathless laughter swept through the TOC. The artillery captain stared at his screen, shaking his head in disbelief. Corporal Rostova slumped back in her chair, a wide grin spreading across her face. Davies let out a breath he seemed to have been holding for an hour. The external threat was neutralized. The checkmate had been delivered, not with a bomb, but with an equation. The silence that followed was the sound of salvation, a quiet filled with the immense, undeniable reality of their deliverance. Eris Thorne had not fought the mountain. She had tamed it. In the profound quiet of the TOC, as the dust settled on the drone feed and the men and women of FOB Erebus began to process the miracle they had just witnessed, a single, insistent beep cut through the air. It was the secure satellite communications console, a link to the highest echelons of command, a device used so rarely it was kept under a dust cover. Corporal Rostova, her earlier elation giving way to professional duty, moved to answer it. "Erebus TOC, this is SATCOM Priority Channel," she announced, her voice still a little shaky. "Authentication code, Delta Niner Tango." A voice came through the speaker, a voice that was calm, clear, and carried in weight of authority that dwarfed anyone's in the room. It was not loud or aggressive, but it was a voice accustomed to absolute obedience. "This is Colonel Vance, Joint Special Operations Command. Put the station commander on." Lieutenant Colonel Davies stepped forward, straightening his uniform out of pure reflex. "Colonel Vance, this is Lieutenant Colonel Davies. It's an honor, sir." "Save it, Davies," the voice from the speaker replied, cutting him off without ceremony. "I've been monitoring your local comms traffic and the feeds from Project Damocles. You've had a difficult afternoon." There was a pause. "Is Specialist Thorne available?" The question hung in the air, electric. The entire room turned to look at Eris. She hadn't moved. She was still observing the seismic data, confirming the stability of the valley. She looked up, her expression unreadable, and gave a slight nod toward the console. Davies, confused, held the microphone out. "Dr. Thorne is here, sir." "Put her on," Vance commanded. Eris walked to the console. She didn't take the handset. "Vance," she said, her voice as flat and factual as ever. The entire room flinched at her casual use of the colonel's name. "Eris," the voice replied, and the tone was entirely different. It was the sound of one professional speaking to another. "Give me your assessment. Did the preliminary models hold?" "The resonant cascade model was 98.7% accurate," Eris reported, as if discussing a lab experiment. "The enemy's methodology was more precise than anticipated. They have a competent operator. The harmonic dampening protocol, however, performed above all expectations. The mountain is stable. The asset is secure." "And the internal friction?" Vance asked, his voice taking on a harder edge. Before Eris could answer, Rourke, who had been simmering in a state of shock and rage, finally boiled over. He strode forward, his face purple. "Sir, Colonel Vance, this is First Sergeant Rourke. With all due respect, this woman has completely undermined the command authority on this FOB. She assaulted me. She countermanded direct orders." Vance's voice sliced through his tirade like a laser. "First Sergeant Rourke." The use of his full title was chilling. "I am aware of your actions. I have the full report, including the video from the parade ground surveillance camera. Let me be clear so that even you can understand. You are to stand down. You are to remove yourself from the Tactical Operations Center. You will be confined to your quarters, where you will await a formal investigation for assaulting a civilian, dereliction of duty, and willfully endangering the lives of over 500 U.S. soldiers. Is that understood?" Rourke froze, his mouth hanging open. The blood drained from his face. He looked from the speaker to Davies, to Aris, his mind unable to process the total reversal of his universe. "Sir, she's just a scientist." A dry, humorless chuckle came from the speaker. "First Sergeant, you are a tactical NCO. You are very good at making men march in straight lines and clean their rifles. But you are standing in a room with the woman who wrote the book on fourth-generation warfare. You think you're fighting men with guns. She is preparing for a war fought with physics." The final revelation landed with the force of an artillery shell. "Lieutenant Colonel Davies," Vance continued, his tone now directed at the stunned commander. "The person you know as Dr. Thorne is the lead architect and chief scientist of Project Damocles. Her civilian status is a cover. For the purposes of her mission, her authority on all matters pertaining to environmental and asymmetrical threats is absolute. Her operational equivalency is that of a 2-star general. You were not informed because her presence was meant to be a quiet, final field validation of the system. The enemy attack was an unscheduled, but exceptionally useful live-fire test." Vance paused, letting the weight of his words settle. "You just witnessed her save your entire command from annihilation after your first sergeant, in his infinite wisdom, decided to physically assault one of this nation's most critical strategic assets. The only reason he is not currently in irons on a transport plane to a black site is because Dr. Thorne does not consider him significant enough to warrant the paperwork. Am I making myself clear?" "Yes, Colonel," Davies whispered, his voice barely audible. Crystal clear, Rourke stood there, a broken man. His career, his identity, his entire worldview had been dismantled in less than 5 minutes by a voice from a box and a woman he had dismissed as an eccentric. The physical collapse on the parade ground was nothing compared to this. This was the utter annihilation of his ego. He turned, his shoulders slumped, and without another word shuffled out of the TOC. A ghost in his own life. The giant had not just been felled, he had been erased. A new order settled over FOB Erebus in the hours that followed. It was not an order dictated by rank or regulation, but one born of awe and a healthy dose of fear. The soldiers of the battalion now looked at Aris Thorne not as the weird rock lady, but as something far more elemental. They saw her as a priestess of a hidden world, a woman who could speak to the mountains and command them to be still. They gave her a wide berth, their conversations dropping to a whisper when she passed. They would watch her as she went about her work, collecting her samples and observing her datapad, and they would see not a scientist, but a force of nature walking in their midst. The air of casual dismissal was gone, replaced by a profound, respectful silence. The shift was most apparent in the small things. When she entered the chow hall, a path would clear for her. The logistics officer who had once grumbled about her power requirements personally ran a new dedicated line to her container. Lieutenant Colonel Davies now approached her not with orders, but with questions, his reports held out like offerings. He asked for her analysis on everything from convoy routes to the placement of new defensive barriers. He had learned the most important lesson of his command. True authority is not worn on a collar, but carried in the mind. But the acknowledgement that mattered most to Aris came not from the commander or the hushed reverence of the troops. It came late that night. She was in her lab, analyzing the final data from the dampening protocol, when a soft knock came at her door. She opened it to find Corporal Eva Rostova standing there, holding a steaming mug in one hand and a datapad in the other. "Ma'am," Rostova began, her voice quiet and earnest, "I brought you coffee, and I was looking at the algorithm you used to derive the counter-resonance sequence from the artillery impacts. It's not a standard Fourier transform. It's something else. It accounts for geological density and elasticity in real time. It's predictive." She hesitated, then held out her datapad. "I know I don't have the clearance, but the math, it's beautiful. Could you just show me the base principle?" Aris looked at the young corporal. She saw no hero worship in her eyes, no fear. She saw genuine intellectual curiosity. She saw a mind that recognized the elegance of the solution, that valued the logic over the outcome. This was the only currency Aris truly respected. For the first time since arriving at FOB Erebus, a flicker of something other than pure analysis crossed her features. It was not a smile, but it was a softening, an acknowledgement. She stepped aside, holding the door to her lab open. "Come in, Corporal," she said. "The principle is called isostatic recursion. Let me show you." Her purpose there was fulfilled. The system had been validated under the most extreme conditions imaginable. The human element, both its fallibility and its potential, had also been thoroughly tested. A few days later, a single unmarked Black Hawk helicopter descended onto the FOB's landing pad, its rotors kicking up a storm of dust. Aris Thorne emerged from her container, carrying a single small case and her datapad. She walked across the tarmac, her stride as purposeful and silent as the day she arrived. Lieutenant Colonel Davies and Corporal Rostova stood watching. They did not salute. They simply stood, silent witnesses to her departure. She boarded the helicopter without a backward glance, and it lifted into the sky, a dark shape against the vast, silent mountains. She left behind a stable valley and a humbled command structure. First Sergeant Rourke was a lesson written in the geology of consequence, a man broken not by a fist, but by a fact. For the soldiers of FOB Erebus, the world was irrevocably changed. The mountains no longer looked like inert knives against the sky. They looked like an instrument, a vast and complex weapon waiting for a command. And they had met the woman who knew how to play it. They knew her name, but they would forever think of her as the ghost of the mountain, a quiet professional whose true power lay not in what she could destroy, but in what she could understand.